We're here with Peter Evans, who's a recent addition to the Berkeley Sociology Department. He's most well known for his work, Dependent Development, which examines the relationship between multinational, local, and state capital in Brazil. Presently, he's working on a book which examines the role of the state in the development of high technology industry in Korea, Brazil, and India. And I'm Rhonda, this is Sean, this is Eddie, and Cecilia. Sean's going to start first.
Okay, I have 3 questions that I'd like to ask in the 10 minutes that I have. First of all, I'd like to ask you, how did you decide to work within the tradition that you see yourself working in? And how did you begin to develop your own distinctive theoretical viewpoints out of that tradition, departing from it?
Well, I think that my choice of what tradition to work in was really very contingent on the historical point at which I started working on development. When I was an undergraduate, I spent a year in Africa and thereby became interested in development. And so when I started my graduate work, I continued that interest in development. Now, at that point, which we're talking here roughly late 60s, in the environment in which I was in, which is Harvard University, it was the home of modernization theory, and I in fact worked on the Incoles project, which later became the book Becoming Modern, and is certainly I think a classic piece of research in modernization theory. So I came out of a tradition of sort of mainstream sociology in the home of mainstream sociology at that time, the home of Talcott Parsons, etc. And I came out of that with an interest in development. And I think, like many other people of my generation, I found the theoretical tradition which I was given as pretty inadequate to deal with what I saw as the salient problems of developing countries. And so consequently, I looked around for other kinds of theoretical traditions which might, in my view, come closer to dealing with what I saw as the principal problems of developing countries. And in fact, when I first started working on Brazil, I was not working particularly in a tradition of dependency or the kinds of works that I came later to deal with. But in the course of an initial field trip to Brazil, etc., it became apparent to me that the most interesting and appropriate kinds of things for me to work on were the kinds of things that dependency theory, etc., was talking about. And so I was kind of pushed into that tradition, I would say, by a combination of my own sense of what the important issues were, and by what was available in the surrounding intellectual environment.
Mm-hmm. Secondly, I wanted to ask you, in the book on dependent development, how did you arrive at the term dependent development as the title? And how did you decide, you identified 3 categories in particular: international capital, local capital, and the state, as being the most relevant to the situation. How did you decide that these were the categories you were going to focus on? And would you say that decision was driven more by theory or by the empirical evidence that you found?
Well, to start out with the title of course comes from Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who had been, in fact, while I was down doing the field work for the thing, Cardoso came out with an article called the traditions of dependent associated development. And I kind of dropped out the associated because I thought it may have sounded too many words there. But basically the title associates me with a particular stream of thinking within the dependency tradition, which is basically a sort of historical, structural, what I would call a Cardozian version of dependency theory. And that actually sort of relates to what I didn't answer on your first question, which is how I see myself as kind of coming out of or contributing to the tradition of which I see myself a part. And that has very much to do both with the title and also with the categories. Because of course the dependency tradition had, at the time I started working in it, I think a dominant view, which was that dependency was inimical to development, even if development was narrowly defined as the accumulation of capital. And Cardozo, of course, was making the argument, well, no, not necessarily. And I think that my sort of role in this tradition was to develop that no, not necessarily, in the direction of saying, well, in fact, you can have the accumulation of industrial capital, a differentiation of the industrial production establishment, etc., all simultaneously with a persistence of dependence. And in making that argument, it became critical to stop talking simply about national capital and foreign capital and to bring, so to speak, bring the state into the picture. Because the only way, or at least the only way I could see that you could get a sort of consistent argument which would break out of the kind of logic of foreign capital arguments that Paul Moran and others had developed, was to introduce some kind of new constraint on that logic of capital. And the state was the most obvious source of that kind of constraint.
So would you say that reaching the conclusion that dependent development was possible, and that dependency wasn't just a fetter on development, was that conclusion derived mostly from your theoretical familiarity with theoretical work, or was it a product of going to Brazil and seeing the situation there and deciding that the Brazilian case, it really had to be described that way?
I think the theory provided the context. I think the case clearly demanded a revision of the theory, so that it was the sort of historical evidence which required. I mean, in a sense, you could consider Brazil in the 70s as an anomaly in relationship to a theory which predicted that dependence would produce stagnation.
Yeah. Okay, and my last question is a little bit more on methodology, I guess, or on a particular method. I'm interested in linking the categories of your analysis to the actually collecting evidence. And specifically, I wanted to ask you how, when you decided that these categories were the ones you're going to look at, local capital, international capital, and the state, once you've decided on these categories, can you describe the process by which these categories get narrowed down to specific interviews with individuals? How does the selection process get made?
It's not exactly that the categories get narrowed down to particular individuals. That is to say, the sort of methodology which I use is a very kind of eclectic and somewhat messy methodology. And so that the individuals that I interview don't necessarily, aren't necessarily sort of representative of that entire category or concept of local capital or foreign capital. What I'm doing usually when I look for interviews is I'm looking for kind of particularly interesting sub-cases within those larger categories that I think will illustrate some important features of the categories. For example, in the case of my original work in Brazil, I started out with the pharmaceutical industry. Okay? Now, the pharmaceutical industry is an arbitrary cut. Okay? It was chosen because at that time the pharmaceutical industry epitomized a denationalized industry, an industry in which foreign capital had taken over almost completely from what had been a locally controlled industry. Okay? Now, that's not representative of local capital, but it illustrates a particular case. Nor does the pharmaceutical industry per se sort of prove my general thesis.
Right.
In other words, in order to actually demonstrate the thesis, I had to, say, hey, look, this is what I found in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, what else do I need to really understand what local capital is doing? In general, I have used the strategy in this kind of research of focusing on sectors. That is to say, from the pharmaceutical industry, really, I think probably the most important thing in terms of developing the book was to say, well, let's look at the petrochemical industry.
Yeah.
Okay? And then once you've said you want to look at the petrochemical industry, then a set of actors are sort of self-evident in terms of who you need to talk to in order to understand that industry. So that there's a selection depending upon the cruciality of a particular subsector of the larger category that you want to look at, and then having made that, then it's really sort of you try to get as many people and as much of the kind of self-evidently important actors in that subsector as you can.
Well, I'd like to follow up, but I think we better move on.
Professor Evans, my questions are mostly more or less on your value and your intellectual commitment. Independent development, you mentioned that you hope that the book gave a coherent and useful account of what you study. So what do you mean by being coherent and useful? And how do you contrast with quite a traditional view of being objective and true?
Well, I think that the question of coherence arises because the kinds of things I study, at least in my view, are incredibly complicated and difficult to present in a sort of cut and dried way. In other words, the kinds of cases that I look at are all probably overdetermined, probably in principle amenable to alternative kinds of explanations which are empirically indistinguishable. That is to say, one could probably derive at least a half a dozen different theories to explain the reality of Brazil in the 70s. Different theories that it would be, I think, virtually impossible to say, well, this is correct because the empirical evidence clearly falsifies all other six. And so therefore it's hard to make the stronger claim that you have arrived at the one unique possible interpretation of this empirical reality. So coherence, and if you notice there when I use the term coherence, I also talk about a convincing kind of portrayal of that reality. Coherence implies that it's logically consistent, that it fits the facts that are presented, that it's not obviously falsified by the facts that form part of the story. But it's a little less strong than saying this is the only conceivable way that you could have that you could have interpreted that reality, which sort of brings us to useful, right? Because it's not simply having a coherent story to tell about the reality, it's also a question of having a useful story to tell. And useful really has two important meanings. One is useful in the sense of, does this story speak to current theoretical debates which are more general, which go beyond the particular evidence that you're investigating? Does it in some way answer questions that those debates are asking? Does it resolve perhaps anomalies that have emerged out of those debates? Or does it point to anomalies which force those debates forward? So useful has a useful in terms of the sort of community of discourse out of which you come, in terms of the kinds of theoretical context in which you're working. Useful, I think, also has, at least in principle, the question of, is it useful to actors who are involved in that social reality? Is it something which people who are themselves struggling to come to terms with, deal with, perhaps change that reality? Is it something that makes sense to them? Do they read it and they say, oh yeah, this in some way makes things clearer for me as an actor in the situation? And those two kinds of usefulnesses, of course, don't the same thing does not necessarily produce both kinds of usefulnesses, and insofar as you can get both kinds of usefulnesses, I think that's a sort of measure of work that you can feel successful about.
I see. On that point, I think my next question would be particularly relevant. What is your view on ethical, neutral, or value-free research, and how do you see your type of sociology in relation to those concepts?
Well, I think that the kind of work I do can never be viewed as something which is floating in the air, independent of one's own feelings about what are important problems in the world, and therefore to say that it's value free, I don't think it could make too much sense. I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody doing this kind of work without understanding that it had some kind of relationship to their values. And in fact, I think were someone to claim that they were doing this kind of work and that it was absolutely unrelated to their own value preferences, that would be highly suspicious and would suggest that they were sort of repressing considering those kinds of issues. Now, at the same time, I think it's important that I at least feel that one of my values is that truth is important, and that it is important to come as close as one can to providing a description or an interpretation of that reality which is verifiable by other people, and to some degree even other people who may not share the same values. I mean, to the extent to which you can do that is obviously limited. But I think that it would be a sort of, what can I say? It would be a betrayal of at least my values to provide an interpretation which happened to fit with what I wanted to believe was the case, but did not correspond to the empirical reality that was out there. In other words, just to give an example, if I had come up with an interpretation that said, that Brazil was on the verge of a revolution which would, overthrow the existing forms of inequality and bring about social justice and substantive democracy throughout the country, that might have been a nice conclusion to come out with, but to say that would have in some sense realized my values would be absolutely wrong as far as I'm concerned, because that empirically was not the case, and to have come up with a portrayal that was clearly empirically false would have been very unuseful, both in theoretical terms and to actors involved in the process. So that it is, I think, extremely important to understand that, in your role as an intellectual or somebody who's doing research, that value of coming up with accounts that are in some sense true, at least coherent and useful and empirically verifiable, that value is tremendously important and has to be seen as a tool in implementing whatever other values you're interested in implementing.
My last question is about a very interesting comment made by one of your colleagues, Florestan Fernandez.
Yeah, right.
When he wrote the foreword for your book, he said that you escape the deformed intellectual leftism, and your interpretive orientation indicate a movement is underway in the United States to move toward a new type of Marxism. First of all, maybe you can explain to us what he is trying to say, and then if you agree with him that you are going toward a new type of Marxism, and if yes, what is that type of Marxism?
I'm afraid that I don't know what Florestan was trying to say. I think that Florestan's interpretation has to be seen as coming out of his own trajectory, and I'm not quite sure what he meant. In part because he has a very complicated trajectory of his own, in which he starts out being an important exponent of sort of Parsonsian functionalism in Brazil, and ends up today. Florestan is a deputy, at least I think, in the
Labor Party.
yeah, in the Federal Congress of Brazil, and I think it's fair to say is one of the most sort of people most militantly and uncompromisingly on the left in that political body, and so he's sort of undergone a very interesting political trajectory of his own, one which has diverged significantly from people like Cardoso, and so I think that his own vision of what it is that I'm doing has to be seen in terms of his trajectory, and I honestly can't tell you exactly what he meant by that, but
then do I have time to follow up?
yeah.
So then how do you situate your type of sociology in the Marxist tradition, if that is possible?
Dependency and relationships between core countries and peripheral countries is one that grows out of a Marxist tradition. That said, it's also the case that the Marxist tradition in the sort of classic sense is best represented by, I think in terms of current work, is best represented by people like Bill Warren. And Bill Warren, of course, negates the very supposition of dependency theory by saying, no, dependency, i.e. Increasing involvement of capital from the core and peripheral countries, dependency is not only in no way associated with stagnation, but is the primary motor by which less developed areas will develop. And that's a position that is quite distinct from my position, since while arguing that development can take place in the context of dependency, I am stressed very heavily the notion that is not simply a diffusion of the kind of development that one sees in the core, but that it has a very different and I think it's fair to say perverse kind of character, being characterized by much higher levels of inequality, being characterized by a much weaker affinity between development and democracy, and being characterized by a continuing problematic in terms of maintaining the rhythm of accumulation, since that rhythm depends upon this alliance or sort of combination of cooperation and conflict that I call an alliance, which involves the state as well as various forms of capital. So my position is really very different than one that would come out of the classic Marxist theories of imperialism, at least as represented by Bill Warren, which I think he is the most legitimate heir to classic Marxist theories of imperialism.
So do we want to
We
take a
should-
short break?
Yeah, we're gonna take a break now. Okay. The first question that I wanted to ask you is, what role do you think that your race and nationality has played in your interviews with people in Brazil and India and Korea? And how do you think being an American professor has affected your ability to gain information and the type of information that you in fact get?
Well, I think that, I mean, I'm mainly dealing with elite folks, and I think that in most cases, being an American is more of an advantage than a disadvantage. And that's in part because people sort of see you as a kind of outsider, as someone who's not an immediate actor in the situation, and who therefore is perhaps less threatening than someone would be who was, a clear participant in the reality that you're looking at. So that I think being an American in most of the work that I've done has given me an appearance of distance, which is useful in making people more willing to talk about what their views are, what they think's going on, etc. So I would say in most of the stuff that I've done, that being an American has been more an advantage than a disadvantage. And I'm not sure that would be the case, in doing other kinds of research. But I think I would go beyond that and say that it's, unless you're trying to really sort of penetrate kind of the personal level of people's experience, that people in general are pretty willing to talk about what it is they're doing and why they're doing it and so on. I mean, I've never had any trouble in any of the work that I've done about getting people to talk to me. And these, the people I'm trying to talk to are generally people whose time is incredibly tight and constrained and so on. And I've always been surprised at the degree to which people enjoy actually having someone to talk to who is not an immediate actor in their environment, somebody who is not, their immediate subordinate, boss, competitor, what have you, and who, as far as they're concerned, and that's not unrealistic, whose the consequence of talking to this person is reasonably minimal. I mean, you do get some people who think you're a CIA agent or an agent from some other company or something like that. But in general, people are pretty willing to talk about this.
Okay. My second question is, especially in dependent development, but in all of your work, it's very macro-sociological. And I was really interested in your insistence on using interviews. And you talk in dependent development about wanting to do that for two reasons. First of all, so that you can just physically understand exactly what's going on within the businesses and et cetera, but also so that you can understand the world views of the people that you're studying. And given your macro-sociological focus, why do you place an importance on that particular understanding?
It's been my experience that not everybody, but at least some of the people who are involved in this stuff actually have theories, interpretations, etc., of what's going on that are in many ways superior to what you would come up with just looking at a bunch of, quote unquote, sort of objective external evidence. The social world is sufficiently complex so that you can't simply, sort of stare at it from the outside and understand why people do things or what it is that connects this with that and so on. And people who are actually involved in doing it have an understanding of that if you can capture that, it goes far beyond what you could discern just by looking at statistical evidence, at sort of documentary stuff and so on. And in my case at least, it's been quite important. I mean, it's not that you can necessarily take those theories and just transplant them and write them down. But they give you tremendously important clues, I think, as to what's happening. They sort of reveal what's important in a situation and what might seem to you as an outsider to be important, but which is in fact sort of superfluous and doesn't play a role in the decisions and behavior of the people who are involved in the situation. So I would be very wary of doing this kind of work just looking from the outside, just reading company reports or something like that. I think it'd be extremely, extremely difficult to come up with, reasonable interpretations. Which is not, other people would say, hey, it's, if you really sort of dig through archives and things like that, that you can get this, and which may be true. But in my experience, people's own conceptualization of what's going on is a tremendously important resource in terms of your understanding of what's going on.
Okay, and my third question is, independent development, imperialism and the role of multinational corporations is critical to the understanding of what's going on with industrial capital in Brazil. But in your more recent work, you seem to, you're only focusing on the relationship between state and local capital. And I'm thinking particularly of India and the informatics industry. And so I was wondering if that was simply a shift of focus or if there was some kind of theoretical shift going on there also.
Well, in fact, that's not actually true. I mean, that is an accurate characterization of that particular article. Mm-hmm. But the reason that particular article only does the state and local capital is because you can only do so much in an article. And the study as a whole, the role of foreign capital remains a very salient part of the argument. I think it is fair to say, though, that I have become more interested in the dynamics that connect the state and local capital than I was in looking at Brazil. I mean, I think that in the dependent development book, the elaboration of the way in which the state and local capital are connected is, I would say, relatively weak. It's certainly not the strongest part of the analysis, and I think as I've gone along, I've felt a need of understanding that better, in part because I'm trying harder to understand how the state as an actor works. And in understanding how the state as an actor works, then I have to look harder at that relationship between the state and local capital. Now, it's also the case that neither India nor Korea are countries in which the role of multinational capital historically in the economy has been anything like as important as its role historically in Brazil. So there's also a difference when you look at other cases. The kind of historic importance of multinational capital may be a little less as well. But I mean, it's not that I've given up looking at foreign capital. I mean, my own individual contribution to the bringing the state back in is all on what I call transnational linkages, and that is to say, it's essentially all on foreign capital in the state, and talks relatively little about local capital in that one.
Well, my question linked to this concept of dependent development and also your methodology. This book, Dependent Development, was written by the late 70s. And so now that almost 15 years have passed and you have done research on Brazil recently and on India and informatics industry, would you still characterize Brazil and India as a case of dependent development? Has this notion for you shifted over time? And if it has shifted, this is because of theoretical reasons or because of your new empirical observations or because of both?
I would still characterize Brazil as a case of dependent development. I think that the sort of basic model there remains a true one. I do, however, think that there were some serious flaws in that characterization of Brazil, and the principal serious flaw, in my view, is the fact that it was an argument which was based almost exclusively, in terms of its analysis of the modern period, on looking at the industrial sector, and therefore an argument which saw the important differences between Brazil and other patterns or trajectories of development as related primarily to the character of the industrial sector, which in turn threw tremendous weight on the role of foreign capital. If I were going to try to write another book on Brazil, which I'm not, I think I would feel compelled to devote much more attention to the political residue created by the persistence of agrarian power structures in Brazil than I did in that book. Because I think that when you look at Brazil comparatively, particularly in relation to the East Asian cases, you can't help but be struck by the degree to which the differences between those cases in Brazil are related not to differences in industrial structure, but to differences in agrarian structure. And I think that there's been some very good recent work on Brazil, particularly at the political level, sort of documenting the way in which traditional agrarian power holders continue to play a tremendous role in the political structure. And I mean, it's not that wasn't kind of there when I was doing the work, but I think that my own preoccupation with industrial development led to a relative neglect of the tremendous importance of the agrarian inheritance in shaping the politics and the economics of an industrialized Brazil. The other thing that I think I'm still struggling with, and this again is primarily the result of sort of comparative observation, is that my characterization of dependent development focused very heavily on this sort of exclusivity, tremendous degrees of inequality, etc. In the East Asian cases, you have examples where dependent development is not, it's not the same trajectory, but it is, there are certain similarities. But in terms of the sort of gross evidence, this same kind of exclusiveness in terms of the development strategy just isn't there, at least at the level of economic inequality. It just isn't there. It's not, levels of economic inequality are relatively speaking low. So that's that's an anomaly. That's a sort of paradox in terms of my notions of what creates that inequality, and that again throws me back again on the question of what is it about the role of the state in here, and it also reinforces my feeling that you have to look more at agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the sort of short answer is that kind of comparative context really forces me to look at some of the aspects of dependent development in a new light, and to push on factors that were relatively neglected in the original analysis.
So mainly your observations on the
I would say that
Asian.
the changes in my perspective have been forced primarily by looking at other cases, at comparative cases.
And well, I'm going to switch to the methodology. In your more recent works
Mhm.
on the way third world states affect development, you have grounded your explanations on the assumptions of the new comparative political economy approach. And so, compared with its predecessors, like dependence theories and world system, do you think that this new comparative political economy approach implicates a progress for the field, and how do you characterize this progress?
Well, I think that in part my answer to your last question is also part of the answer to this question. That is to say, I think the new comparative political economy involves an incorporation of a broader range of historical context, and consequently forces what I would consider to be a more generally applicable kind of theoretical frame onto the analysis. And I think that there has been, over the past 15 or 20 years, a breaking down of work, of the barriers, of the sort of walls that separate work on different regions, on different developing areas, and also certainly in the case of Europe and Latin America, there's been a certain dissolving of the separation between theoretical arguments and empirical observations on developed countries and those that were made with relation to developing countries, so that you've expanded the range of material that you're at least implicitly dealing with. I mean, it's not that people can effectively do studies that study the whole world at the same time, but when when I look at India, or when somebody else looks at Mexico, they're much more likely now to have as their context a sort of set of ideas, theories, etc., which are drawn from a much fuller scope of empirical analysis, a much sort of broader range of material to be dealt with. And that has also, I think, resulted in a somewhat more sophisticated set of theoretical propositions and you know, set of conceptualizations as to what makes development work.
So my last question. So why, as Susan has been studying development since the 60s, do you think, and you have said now, that the new comparative political economy approach provides a research program? And what do you understand by this research program? How do you characterize this?
Yeah, I would say that it does provide a research program, and I think that that research program hasn't been sort of laid out as explicitly as I would like, and is something which is still in the process of construction. But I think it is. I think it is a research program whose essential characteristic right now is the attempt to integrate the kinds of concerns arising out of studies of international disparities in historical trajectories of development, to integrate them with the sort of classic analyses which are concerned with basically national trajectories of development, and by that I mean which are concerned with questions of accumulation and distribution within particular societies. And I think that you know, you start out with a set of theories or a set of conceptualizations which look at national trajectories of development as though you could universalize them, and then you have a whole tradition which looks at national trajectories of development as though they were primarily determined by position in an international political economy, and then you begin to try to get those two things working at the same time, and begin to try to get more of a sense of how position in the international political economy and domestic dynamics of political conflict and resolution and questions of accumulation and distribution, how those dynamics can be fitted into a vision of an international political economy without negating the notion that those dynamics do have a logic of their own, which is not simply suppressed or superseded by the international political economy. At the same time, I think that the new comparative political economy does involve or incorporates a sort of more complicated way of looking at the dynamics of relations between the state and civil society. Now, if you put that together, that's a pretty overwhelming research program. And so, you know, obviously on the one hand, it's still somewhat amorphous and in the process of definition, and on the other hand, you know, any individual participant has to pick out some piece of that to look at, and is unlikely to be able to, you know, attack the whole thing at the same time. If there's one problem with the whole business. I would say that the sheer sort of scope and diversity of the work, which I see as interconnected, makes it harder to sustain a sort of effectively interacting community in the sense of people really getting back and forth across different kinds of work. It's, you know, it's hard to keep as much interaction among different pieces of work going on as you would like to have in order to develop a real research program.
Okay.
Great, well, thank you, yeah.
That's
Thank
all
you.
I-
Okay. So Eddie can have his cookie now.
I had a couple